Welcome to Ancient Faith Today Live. This is Father Tom Soroka. I'm so glad that you're with us. Thanks for hanging in there with us. We got a little bit of just a few minute late start today, but we are so glad that you're here. We are now in the Apostles' Fast, and I hope that things are going well for you. It's always a little bit hard to do that right in the middle of summer, so I hope that you are gaining strength as we near the feast of the Apostles Peter and Paul and the Synaxis of the Apostles. So today we're going to be tackling a little bit of a controversial subject. We're going to be talking about the claims of a former Orthodox priest. I think some people do know about him. Some people don't know about him. Of course, we're not here to promote him. We're certainly not here to promote the idea of leaving the priesthood or leaving orthodoxy, but we do have to answer his claims because some of them are very serious, and people that are not discerning will listen to these claims and be swayed by some arguments that might be made to those who are weaker in the faith, to those who are less knowledgeable. And so we want to make sure that you have a firm foundation in the tradition, and that includes, of course, primarily the scriptures, but also the writings of the Fathers, the divine liturgy, the canons, the iconography, and everything that God has given to us as Orthodox Christians. And today we are once again joined by Joshua Sherman. Joshua is really a tremendous asset to us, and he has various very clear views on our understanding of the Orthodox faith. So I asked him to join us today to, we're going to sort of tag team here to talk about these particular issues about the former priest, Joshua Schooping, and his claims about the Orthodox faith. Joshua, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here, and I hope the fact that my name and his name are so similar doesn't get a little bit confusing.
I almost stepped on it that time, so we're going to talk about maybe Mr. Schooping. I don't know, and then we'll simply call you Joshua. How's that?
Perfect.
All right. Okay, here we go. So there's a couple ways that everybody can participate. First of all, go into the YouTube channel at youtube.com/Ancient Faith Ministries. You'll see us streaming live right there. Also, you can go to facebook.com/Ancient Faith Ministries. You'll see us streaming live there. You can also send us a text message to 412-206-5012. We're ready to take your text messages right there. And we want to know what you have to say. Have you heard of this guy? Have you read any of the things that he has written? Do you think that he has a point about some of his disagreements with orthodoxy? It's hard for me because I am an Orthodox priest and I want to defend the Orthodox faith. I will die an Orthodox Christian. And if God wills it, I will die as an Orthodox priest, but that's entirely up to him. So before Josh and I get started to counter Mr. Schooping's claims, I want to say a few things. So I'm going to ask if we can bring up the first slide, and just to kind of understand what we're doing here. And that is, we are countering the claims of a former Orthodox priest. And again, feel free to bring in any of the comments that are relevant here. Somebody said here in the comment section already, they kind of said, and I'm not here to take cheap shots. I really am not. I promise you. I'm not here to take cheap shots. I pray for Mr. Schooping. I hope that he comes to his senses. However, somebody here said, like, well, what religion is he now, right? Because He's bounced around a little bit. He was a Protestant, and then he became Orthodox, and then he's a Protestant again. And while now he has landed in Lutheranism, but he was something else before that. And then he defended why he did that. He said that was just a placeholder. This is a problem. It's a problem because one of the first qualifications, read 1 Timothy, read Titus, right? One of the qualifications in being called to be a presbyter, and even for the office of episkopos, of bishop, of overseer, which of course applies to the priesthood in many ways also, is stability. You have to have stability in your life. You have to demonstrate that, right? And if you're flitting back and forth between religions, this does not bode well for your credibility. And again, I'm not speaking about Mr. Schooping in this particular aspect, but I think we have to make sure that when we are discerning who is going to be a priest, who is going to be the one to be called to the priesthood, let's make sure that we are calling men who have demonstrated stability, right? Stability and clarity of thought, and that they're not coming into the Orthodox faith with all kinds of questions and all kinds of doubts, or they're not going to seminary. I know there was a previous video talking about things that he had said about when he was in seminary. Ordination to the priesthood is extremely serious. It is a very, very, it is one of the greatest privileges that God can bestow on any unworthy servant, but you have to be prepared. And look at this slide number 3 here. I love this particular aspect of the ordination to the priesthood. It is especially this particular moment after someone is ordained to the holy priesthood, after the consecration of the gifts. Look at this slide. Look at what it says here. I want everybody, even in the chat, I want you to look at this. It says, after the consecration of the Eucharist, the bishop places the body of Christ into the new priest's hands with the following admonition: receive this divine trust and guard it until the second coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, at which time he will demand it from you. These are serious words. These are the words to a man who is now devoting his life to the service of Christ and his church and the gospel. You see? And now this is a problem when you are coming into the church with doubts, when you are being ordained with doubts, when you are in seminary with doubts. And I'm going to say one more thing before we get started here. And again, please don't think that I'm making this personal, or I am taking personal shots at Mr. Schooping. But I have a problem, next slide, I have a problem with anyone who is making his religious journey, wherever it goes, into a grift. Look at this. Look at this list of books that he has for sale on Amazon.com. He has writings of the saints. He has a manual of theosis. He has a manual for evangelism. He has the documents of catechism and the catechism of St. Peter Mogila, the confession of Dositheus, all for sale on Amazon.com, along with his latest work, Disillusioned: Why I Left the Eastern Orthodox Priesthood and Church. This takes I don't even want to say the word. I don't even want to say what it takes to scurrilously offer these Orthodox texts for sale when you are criticizing them. This is absurd. This makes someone into a grifter who is simply trying to profit off of the writings of the saints, the writings of the fathers. Now, someone can say, well, secular press sell these things. Yes, but he knew better. He is now repudiating the things that are in these documents, and yet he's selling them on Amazon. He should repent of this. He should delete those books from Amazon and sell his little story, Disillusioned. Stick with that, but don't sell these writings of these holy people that you repudiate and that you left the priesthood over. You should not do this. It's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. Okay. Rant over. Now, let's go to the first. We only had time for like 5 topics. Okay. We only had time for 5 topics. And you can go out, you could watch his videos, but we tried to kind of distill this as much as possible. Here's the first claim, and Josh, I'm going to ask you to chime in here. His first claim is, let's bring up slide number 5. The Orthodox have confused the gospel. They don't properly distinguish between law and gospel. Now, when I heard that in his latest video, I did a spit take because I thought, oh, well, now he's just become, he kind of has bought into the Lutheran claim, right? Because it's always about this distinction between law and gospel, right? So, Josh, help us understand this idea of making this distinction between law and gospel in this kind of semi-dispensational way, and where it falls flat to accuse the Orthodox Church of, quote unquote, not making this distinction.
Oh, man. We only have a few minutes. So really, I mean, this is something that, yeah, this is something that Luther put forth, and a lot of it just comes to him reacting to understanding the righteousness of God as God being ready to absolutely punish each and every sin to the minutest degree, and understanding that kind of judgment in terms of law. And then as he read through Galatians, especially, finding that he actually came to a different reading of it. He came to the point where he felt like he had experienced the gospel anew. And so for him, the idea of law and gospel distinction is very much, if it's about judgment, then it's law. And if it's about grace and hope and all of these things, then it's gospel. And we should never, ever let those two things touch each other, because, the gospel is always only about the gospel. And I mentioned this last time, but I don't know what book of Romans he's reading, but in verse 16 in Romans 2, I read, "This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares." So the idea of separating out judgment or law from gospel or good news, like, it doesn't really work even if you just read Paul, let alone the rest of the New Testament. And if you want to dive into this a bit more, I would just point people to Father Andrew Stephen Damick's book, Arise, O God. He has a great summary of the gospel in there, and talking about Christ's defeat of demons, sin, and death. So just a really good way to kind of reset and maybe help people that only have that Lutheran idea of the gospel in their heads to go, maybe this is actually bigger than I think. And maybe it's more beautiful than I think. And maybe I should pay attention to that.
Yeah. And I would broaden this a little bit to say that in common parlance, right, you have depending on what flavor of Protestant you are, you have these 5 solas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is sola gratia, right? That by grace alone.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is very often you will read, they will read, that is, the anytime St. Paul speaks about works, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ephesians 2:8 is the most famous one. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast, right? And St. Paul is very clear constantly when he is speaking about works. He's always speaking about works of the law, always. And they try to make a contradiction between James and Paul, right? Mm-hmm. Luther famously called James an epistle of straw. And I think that there's not enough clarity within Protestantism to say that Christ comes to fulfill the law, but he said, not one jot or tittle will pass away, right? Mm-hmm. And what does that mean? Well, now we have the law of Christ. That is, Christ demonstrates through, specifically, let's say, like most concisely in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. It was said to you, an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, right? It was said to you, do not commit adultery. But I say to you. So the law of Christ is still a thing. He who loves me, keep my commandments. But Protestantism, through Luther's idea, has completely overreacted to this idea and makes this false distinction between the law and the gospel.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
No, I mean, I think that's where a lot of the confusion lies. Even think about things like, grace alone, faith alone, right? And then you start going, okay, but do you understand the relationship between grace and faith, right? There are actually ways that was understood in the ancient world. And if we just disconnect it from that context, then we can talk about grace and faith in any way we want, but it may not actually be the biblical context. So we have to be really careful, I think, to try to be really clear about what those terms mean and the relationship between them, just as we have to do with faith and works.
Yeah, let's talk about one more thing in this claim before we go on. Yeah. And again, I'd like to hear the comments in the comment section. What do you take from that? Those of you that were former Protestants, and I see some of you in there, how did you grapple with this? What I hear again and again from Schooping and from some others is the idea that orthodoxy doesn't even understand the gospel, right? Like they don't have a clear understanding of what the gospel is. Now, I will admit that in it, Orthodox people, if you say to them, what is the gospel? You'll get all kinds of crazy answers that this happens. You say, what is the gospel? They say, oh, it's love, right? and they can't articulate it what it is because Protestantism has distilled in a way the gospel to be a slogan. Yeah. The gospel to be a presentation. We talked about this in a previous show, right? Like you had different presentations of the gospel, whether it was Romans Road, whether it was, whatever it was.
Yeah. Whereas, if you understand what a gospel was in the ancient world, you have Isaiah talking about, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. What is the good news of? It's good news from the battle that your side is victorious. Your God is victorious, right? And that same kind of connotation exists in the first century with the gospels of various Caesars and generals that went around, and they would, be victorious. And then they would come in and say basically like, hey, like you're now into Rome. And here's my gospel, right? It doesn't always mean good news. But what it means is they think it's good news that they're proclaiming to you. And it's going to be good news for you in the ways that they say it is, if they're faithful to their promises, based on whether you are allegiant to the person who's now in charge or not, right? So are you allegiant to Jesus? These are the things you can look forward to, right? Are you not? These are the things that you're going to miss out on. These are the things that are going to be a problem for you, right? Right. The whole idea that gospel just means good news, you have to even contextualize that.
Yeah, but I would take it a step further. I'm not disagreeing with you, just adding one more point. And that is going back to this idea that, understanding the gospel. Read the letters of St. Paul. He speaks about the gospel he speaks about it sometimes specifically, and he says specific statements, but he also speaks about it generally. In other words, all the teaching that he delivered to a church, all of it, he refers to it as the gospel, right? It wasn't just like one principle or one line. At the base of it, of course, was the incarnation of Christ being the Son of God, receiving Christ through faith in baptism, et cetera, all the things that Christ does. But to try to say that somehow the gospel is this formulaic presentation that can be distilled down to a sentence or two is absurd. And Protestantism has cornered the market on that, even though, they don't agree among themselves about what it is.
Yeah, and I think we see that even more, now in modern times when we get into the elevator pitches and the slogans and things, so everybody wants to condense it to get people's attention. So it's just taken an issue of some confusion and maybe made it worse by being so brief that you can barely understand what's going on. So, yeah.
Not my normal day says, I had a systematic theology class that couldn't define what the gospel was after 4 months of arguing about it, right? The point is like that, to distill it down to kind of one thing is not always difficult. And then when you distill it down to one thing, you have to build on that. Again, St. Paul speaks very clearly that the gospel is the entire presentation of the deposit of faith that he was given by the Lord himself, right? All right. Okay, very good. Let's go on to the next one. I know this is your favorite, Josh. All right. The next claim that he makes: modern Orthodox deny penal substitutionary atonement, but the church fathers taught it. Now, before we go into this, I will say that was his hobby horse, and he knows. Simon, I'm sorry. Hold on 1 second. Yeah, I got too anxious here. We have a video to play. Go ahead and play this second video. I'm so sorry. Simon, play the second video.
Who predated Anselm, by the way, he's writing such clear things that sound like this horrid thing called penal substitutionary atonement. You mean Christ actually suffered under the law, the wrath of God, to atone for sin? And then so I share it with a priest, and I say, look, it looks like there are church fathers who teach penal substitutionary atonement. Well, he says, you can't go by just what one father says. Have you ever heard that? Anyone say that? You can't go by just what one father says. I say, okay. And he said, you have to go by the hymns. It's our hymnology where you find our theology. Now, the iterations of our hymn books are going to have different hymns in each hymn book, right? Our LSB right now has hymns that weren't in the TLH, for example, right?
Yeah. So there's his claim. And I apologize. I meant to put up his video claim on the first point, but I jumped ahead. So I know this is his hobby horse because he was, and I'm going to go back here just a little bit, Josh, because this predates you. Okay. In the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, that is the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when there was this neo-patristic revival, right? It was a common thing where you were only focusing on the Eastern Fathers, and it was common to say things like, which, just hear me out. They would say the Orthodox, and this was the Orthodox people saying, the Orthodox don't believe in atonement, or the Orthodox don't believe in penal substitutionary atonement, right? Now, they said they believe in Christus Victor, and we're going to talk about Christus Victor later. But the problem is that word is very pregnant with meaning. The whole framework of understanding that Protestantism, and I would say even Western Christianity, is kind of built on that framework, right? Of defining a moment as, quote unquote, the atonement, right? So let's kind of look at this just for a second. And by the way, the reason I mentioned that is to say, there were some popular Orthodox theologians and so forth that kind of got this wrong. They overstated the case. However, let's talk about this statement that he makes. Modern Orthodox deny penal substitutionary atonement, but the Church Fathers taught it. Now, obviously, we can't go through the whole thing. It's 10 shows. All right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Josh.
So can we put up that slide that I sent on the semantic world? Yeah,
it's up.
Perfect. Okay. The live stream lags just a little. So I was like, is it up? This is something I just wanted to summarize because I think it's really important when people start talking about this topic. What they're going to do is they're often going to argue for something they would call a mere penal substitution. So they'll say, is there punishment involved? Was it a substitution? Does it make us right with God? Ergo, it's penal substitution, right? And I understand the need for arguing in these ways to try to at least get some sense of like, maybe you can agree with me on some sense of common ground. But I wanted to point out in red below just how many things are often added in people's mind when they think the terms penal substitution, or they start thinking, Jesus died for my sins, right? Because this is a lot more to this than just, did God punish the Son? Did the Father punish the Son on the cross in order to, in our place, instead of punishing us so that we could be saved from hell, right? That's the way that people often frame it. But when you really get into it, penal substitutionary atonement often includes things like justification by faith alone, right? It often includes imputed righteousness. And for Calvinists, it includes double imputation. So you have this, Jesus got all the sin, we get all the righteousness, boom, and so they're bringing all of this framework with them. They're also bringing things like Jesus's atoning work was completed on the cross, which I mentioned last time, right? You can't have that and then have Christ doing atoning work in the heavenly tabernacle after his ascension.
Seated at the right hand of God.
It doesn't work, right? And so that doesn't really work very well either. And then you have things like, what was the punishment, right? Was it just physical death? Was it just the cross? Well, if Jesus needs to be punished the exact price for all of our sins, and we're going to be punished with eternal damnation, then shouldn't he be punished with? So there goes the logic. And all of a sudden you have ideas like, well, Jesus must have died spiritually. He must have become corrupted by sin, ontologically, right? He must have been abandoned by the Father, misreading Jesus' words from the cross and not understanding that that's a quotation of Psalm 22 with all of its context. Talking about, he must have experienced hellfire and the wrath of God, which, by the way, was the way that Calvin introduced this idea into the conversation by explicitly rejecting the harrowing of Hades and saying that's a fairy tale. What actually happened is that Jesus felt the wrath of God in hellfire on the cross, right? These are the ideas about punishment people often bring with them. Then you also have questions about whether Jesus died only for the elect within Calvinism, right? Because if Jesus paid the whole cost, then
Right.
how can we not? So it must either be universalism or he only died for some
Right.
people. And then you carry the logic
Limited
further,
atonement. Right.
and you have like Jesus must have paid for all the sins of believers, including future sins, and therefore it doesn't matter, what you do now, right? And that's where people can keep building on these ideas. I'm not saying that all Protestants have all of these ideas, but when you start to have someone say something like, the fathers taught penal substitutionary atonement, this is all the stuff people bring with them when they think about what that means. And they can get very confused about what the Orthodox Church teaches, what the fathers taught, what we should be believing within the Christian faith. And they can believe a lot of ideas that are actually incorrect because they're being told, no, this was actually taught by the fathers. Right. So I think we need to be very careful and clear about what we do and don't mean, even when we're talking about, relatively simple things like what does penal substitutionary atonement means. For many people, it's this entire slide.
Right. And so essentially what you're saying is, if you say that orthodoxy denies penal substitutionary atonement, all you're saying is, well, it's not one single thing. It is an entire systematic way of explaining, for instance, one more thing that I would say, you did put that, why God has to punish each and every sin to maintain justice. In other words, the honor of God was offended, and therefore his justice has to be assuaged, right? All of these ways of understanding it. The problem is that if you say, well, I don't believe that, then they say, oh, well, you don't believe in the wrath of God, or you don't believe, which is what the scripture says, is that Jesus saves us from the wrath of God, right?
Yeah.
But when somebody who is a proponent of this understanding, and that's what I was trying to say with my video on PSA, at the end of it, I said, what do you mean by penal? What do you mean by substitutionary? And what do you mean by atonement? Like, this is really important. And if it's what he is saying, that, Jesus took, that Jesus was punished by God, then that's a problem, right? And I don't want to sound like Jordan Peterson, but it's like, yeah, well, then what do you mean by punished?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and to put a fine point on it, right? He voted with his feet. So what he means by penal substitutionary atonement, we can probably surmise that he probably means something pretty close to what Luther would say, right? And if you look at what Luther said, there are a couple of places where he talks about this, saying Christ himself suffered the dread and horror of a distressed conscience that tasted eternal wrath. And when he says, you have forsaken me, right? Like that's what he's feeling, right? So Luther believed a lot of these specific things that are on the screen. And again, I would just kind of push back on that and say, if you're not reading Psalm 22 in the entirety, when you look at my God, why have you forsaken me, you're not understanding the context.
Right. And then you get into some really weird beliefs in, very dark corners of Protestantism where they say that, Jesus was forsaken by God.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean? Like, how does that work?
That becomes either Christological heresy or Trinitarian heresy. I don't know how else to see it.
Right. Like, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because and you can say that it's just relational, right? So you could say, well, it's just a relational rift between the Father. But if the Trinity is like inherently relational in the being of God, how are you separating out ontology and relation? Like there's no way to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
one of the problems, I believe, that is just a foundational problem of Protestantism is the understanding that as a Christian, you are handed the Bible and you're just told, figure it out. Like what they'll say, well, the scriptures, there's scriptural perspicuity, right? It's just, it's self-understanding, but we know that's not true. We know that's not true. We just celebrated the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. So we know it's not true. However, when you take yourself away from the tradition, which is the life of the Holy Spirit in the church, then you have to make it up. You have to make it up. So if you say, Jesus said this on the cross, and you say, well, he's speaking for man. he's saying Psalm 22 and he's speaking for man. But to say that somehow the second person of the Trinity was forsaken by the Father, I mean, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So this is a problem. All right.
Well, and I think if you take it out of the tradition, right, what you end up with are things like, well, the language has to mean substitution. And I think this may have happened with some of what he did, where he's reading things in the Fathers, and you'll see a translation that will say, Jesus died in our place, right? And then you read a different translation and it says on our behalf, and you ask what's going on, right? And you start getting into the language and you realize, okay, so if I look at the language behind that in Greek, the same term is used at the beginning of the phrases in the Great Litany in the liturgy, when we say, for the peace of the world, right? For, right? So nice is it voice. Automatically in the place of the peace of the world? That wouldn't make any sense, right? So we have to pay attention to the stuff behind it, and we have to think of it in terms of the tradition. And when you do that, doing things like he does, where he reads the Confession of Dositheus saying that the Eucharist is a propitiatory sacrifice, you can't separate that out from the tradition when you're within the tradition and critique the tradition, when you also have in the liturgy the priest saying we offer bloodless sacrifices. Like something, your framework is broken if you can't make those things work together. And somehow his way of dealing with that problem was not to realize he misunderstood some things, but to decide that the framework must just be broken and I have to leave. Right?
Yeah, there are a lot of videos right now being put out by Protestants. I think it's motivated by so many people coming into the Orthodox Church, going into Roman Catholicism, right? And they're worried. They are truly worried because they're seeing this exodus, right? And so they're putting out all of these videos. Oh, we're going to celebrate the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. Now, it's very interesting because I watched one series, and I think it's by Sola Media or something. And it was actually very good. But again, some of it made me crack up because of the cognitive dissonance when you say, yes, I agree with the fathers of the First Ecumenical Council, right? Like, we agree with that. And I want to say, wait a second. Do you agree with how they worship? With the language of worship? With what they believed about the incarnation? With, what they believed about the communion of the saints, right? I mean, like, you don't just get to pick and choose and say, well, I like this part of the fathers, but I don't like that.
Well, and it's the same kind of thing when you get people that will quote mine St. John Chrysostom, and they'll say, well, this is what he believed, but they don't read him in concert with the liturgy that he wrote. And they don't even realize, like, he wrote a liturgy that was celebrated by priests that were under bishops. And like, it's like the disconnect. And it gets to the point where with that whole thing with the Nicaea conference, there was one of them that was literally going to be meeting in Turkey. It may have already happened. I don't remember exactly. And they talked about pastors from all over the world. They couldn't even say bishops, right? Because that was controversial for them. And it's like, well, who do you think? But okay.
Yeah, right. I wouldn't want to be in Turkey right now, that's for sure. You just watch the bombs fly overhead. Simon, can you put up that text from the text line? I just wanted to respond to this because it's thoughtful. However, let me respond to it. So this text says, when I left Protestantism for Orthodoxy, my family tried to use him against me, but you don't see tons of Orthodox priests leaving. Many more people are actually coming to Orthodoxy. He is one of very, very few leaving, let alone clergy. Truthfully, his objections could be dismantled by any catechumen who's being well catechized. I believe that. However, what I will say is I really get concerned when I do see priests leaving. I agree. I don't see a lot of them, but I see a few. And I think we have to somehow understand that with this influx of converts coming in, we better be darn sure that these men are stable, that they are absolutely convinced that this is something that they are going to be adhering to for life. Souls are at stake for this. This is not a job. And this is not a possible career choice. This is the church, the church of the living God. And we can't treat it like, oh, well, I'm going to be a Protestant this week, and I'm going to be an Orthodox next week, and then I'm going to be a Muslim and whatever. This is really bad. Okay. Let's look at the next one. We have a video first. So if you would, please, Simon, play video number 3.
So if you look at Athenagoras or Athanasius or Tertullian or these earlier writers, they're writing against the use of images in worship. And then you look at what the actual pagan arguments for their use of imagery is really fascinating, because it was Julian the Apostate who made one of these famous arguments in favor of the use of imagery, where it's kind of symbolic, it's kind of semiotic. When you venerate the statue of Zeus, you're not really venerating the statue itself. It's actually a veneration that goes to the real Zeus somewhere. And so what's amazing is that it's a little bit around the time of John of Damascus where they start utilizing the same method of argumentation. They just kind of baptize it, and they just kind of bring it in to the Eastern Orthodox, into the church of the time. And so when I found that, I was like, that's really weird, because the way icons were presented to me was, just an affirmation of the value of aesthetics and sacred art. Truth, beauty, truth, goodness, and beauty. It sounds sounds great. And so when they're presenting this, it almost sounds like a matter of permission. Like, you're allowed to have sacred art. We're free to venerate these images. But when you get down into the actual canons and rulings and decrees and pronouncements in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the Seventh Ecumenical Council being the icon council, they actually say that if you don't venerate the icon, you're anathema. You're going to hell if you don't.
All right. So, this is pretty common, and I think the brouhaha over this really got ginned up by Gavin Ortland, who came out, really against the veneration of icons. He said, well, there's all kinds of problems with the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and Schooping here is saying that this is just warmed over, this is baptized paganism, right? So what are your thoughts about this, Josh, before I take a crack at this? How would you approach this?
So I think there's maybe 2 things to say that are kind of at the core of it. One of them is just realizing, if you're trying to read a lot of this stuff in history by looking back from the place that you are, and then you feel like, I feel uncomfortable with that, or that's weird to me, might I suggest that it's weird to you because your context is extremely different from the context in which it happened, in which it was written. And you might need to get acclimated enough with that context to understand what was going on and what they meant in order to really actually get it. And when you do that, sometimes what'll happen is you go, oh, I'm the weird one, right? I'm the one that actually exists on this, way out here on this chart somewhere here, and on this tree chart that some people have of, the branches of Christianity or whatever, when they try to describe things usually from a Protestant perspective. I'm way out here, but when I look back, that looks weird. It's like, well, why are you way out here? You're way out here because of all of these things that happened in history that got you further and further out from where they were at this point. So for me, when I looked at things and I started to ask the question, what do I do about schism? Am I the weird one? I realized, yes, historically, the way Christianity was understood back then, I am the weird one. And what's the best thing that I can do personally to try to heal the schism? I need to heal the schism I have with the one true Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So that's a thing about just like the general maybe framework for looking at some of these things, and feeling a little bit uncomfortable when you hear things like anathema. Like, what do you do with that, right? The other thing I would say is, if you're thinking that the only arguments that came from the councils were baptized pagan arguments, I think you need to look a little more, because you have St. Basil talking about literally how do we say we don't worship two gods? And he starts talking about the image and the prototype and the Father and the Son. And that is then used in argumentations around, that's not a pagan argument. It's an argument for the Trinity, right? You have St. Theodore the Studite, who's talking a lot, just like St. John of Damascus did, about the incarnation and what it means and how we have Christ both circumcised and uncircumcised. That's not a pagan argument. And if you connect it into even further back, go back to Genesis. If you're not understanding this topic in light of the image of God and the relationship that the image of God has with idolatry, that idolatry is a corruption of that, then you're not understanding the topic, right? So those are the places that I would start in trying to point out how to maybe go at this topic a little bit more holistically.
Right. Indeed, that your point number one about reading history, understanding the background of it is extremely important, right? Yeah. Reading history, just like reading the scriptures, if you're reading it simply with an analytical mind of a person of the 21st century, you will end up in error. There's just no doubt about it, right? The idea that all I have to do is unpack the words grammatically, right, exegetically from the scriptures, and it will produce its own meaning, rather than, look, the Holy Spirit also guides us in understanding. And as we're moving forward, we are understanding these things. We don't go back again and again and again and say, well, the fathers of the Seventh Ecumenical Council were wrong, because they all got together and they said, we should really be like the pagans. We should, we want to get the pagans on our side. And therefore, we're going to set up these pictures and we're going to treat them just like idols, but we're going to say they're not idols because the spirit of the God isn't in them, but we're going to allow them to venerate it. No, there is a whole theology underneath this.
Yes.
It is the most expressive way to understand the incarnation, that the invisible God takes on visible matter to himself and shows the goodness of creation. And then John of Damascus says, I do not venerate matter. I venerate the God who created and sanctified matter, right?
Yes.
Like this is easy.
And that's part of it too, is that if what you're interpreting is just, I don't venerate matter, I'm interpreting a spirit that's behind the matter, right? But you can read that really shallowly and think, well, the pagans must not have thought there were spirits involved, right? Yet Paul says, they worship demons, right? So there is some connectivity that's going on there. It's just not good. It's not worshiping the creator, which is Paul's point in Romans 1, when he says, they've exchanged the glory, right? Well, the glory is imaging language. This is image of God language, right? It's people abdicating who we were created to be, and then placing something between themselves and God in a way that is diverting their attention from God, right? So like the golden calf, that's not a good representation of God. When Jesus becomes incarnate, like to represent the true image of God, like you're representing God, right? It's either that or it's just creation that you're looking at, and you're not actually like connecting into the God himself, right? Those are the problems. But you don't see that if you don't have the image of God in your head. You don't understand the whole framework of how, like, why, what God created us for in the first place.
Right. And it's wonderful if you read St. Maximus the Confessor, who kind of puts it all together, right? For the whole creation and the image of God and the logos, the importance of the logos, right? Okay. Let's go on, because I know we're like almost out of time. Hang in there with us, folks. This is really important, okay? Let's look at the next video. Now, we're going to actually watch 2 videos here. I apologize. I really screwed this up. It's always my fault. Just if something goes wrong, you know it's my fault. So I'm going to ask Simon, play the first video and then the second video. This is important. This is about the essence energies distinction, hesychasm, and how he basically dismisses it and says this is just kind of Eastern exoticism. He basically calls it navel gazing. Check this out.
You guys have heard of the essence energies distinction. It's a distinction that was kind of coined in the time of about the 14th century with Gregory of Nyssa, because he was accused of heresy, because these monks would sit around and practice this sort of navel-gazing prayer technology in order to have mystical experiences of light, of such a brilliant light that they said it was uncreated and that they're literally experiencing God. And so they were accused of heresy. So Gregory Palamas asserts this essence energies distinction so that he can say we're really experiencing God, not in his essence, but in his energies. And so that becomes the part of their whole system of salvation, is to be going through these mystical experiences until you can kind of have that experience. Church is kind of the exotic East. Just the whole notion of the exotic East. You guys, if have you ever heard of conservatives being called xenophobic? Xenophobic. Well, there's a kind of alternative to that for where people have kind of xenophilia, this kind of obsession with the stranger. And so when they see Christianity presented from outside, all of a sudden it's like, oh, wow, I don't have to become Hindu or Buddhist or New Age or a Sufi Muslim or something like that. I can be Christian. And all of a sudden it's like they kind of get the best of both worlds. And so this kind of thing.
That is so, this is unbelievable. I'm going to go backwards here. Saying that Eastern, I hate that term, Eastern Christianity is exotic and it's strange, right? What part of Jerusalem do you not understand, Mr. Schooping? What part of Antioch do you not understand? Alexandria, Constantinople. This is unbelievable. How can you possibly call the ancient Orthodox faith exotic? As if Lutheranism is what it was written in the pages of the Bible and it just leaped out of the scriptures. This is so ridiculous. And then the essence energies distinction, which, you know, we could talk about hesychasm, talk about prayer. The essence energies distinction is an easy one, because if you believe God is unapproachable, the only way you can do that, the Catholics are just wrong here. You cannot say that people partake of the essence of God, because they would burn up. It's that simple. So you have to have some kind of philosophical distinction. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna, I need my blood pressure medicine.
Well, I mean, and I would just point out, if you really want to dig into the essence energies distinction, Nathan Jacobs had David Bradshaw on his podcast on episode 2. They talk a lot about this. That distinction is not something that came up in the 14th century. It may have been articulated in a particular way for a particular argument by Palamas, but it's not a new thing. The language, especially behind it, is Pauline, at least. And actually, you see examples of this in Second Temple Judaism outside of Paul. So, like, it's just not a new thing.
Let me just say, so everybody understands, you have to look at an interlinear Bible to understand this, English readers, because what the English Bibles do, anytime the word energia comes up, they don't translate it as energy. They translate it as what? I don't even remember.
It's usually like working or something like that.
Work, right.
Yeah.
It's just, and if you just read it as energia, it makes total sense. I'm sorry, Josh, go ahead.
No, that's great. I mean, because essentially that often is read through Latin. So I think it's operatio, right? So the work instead of the energia, and you start getting things a little bit confused. And you can start misreading things like Paul, where, he'll say, like, yes, I planted and Apollos watered, but God gave the growth, right? Well, who did the work there? It's all of them. There's a synergia, right? And he actually uses synergistic language there to describe what's going on in preaching the gospel, right? And you can clearly see that he understands things in that way more broadly than just that. We also see it when you have, talking about working out your own salvation, because it's God who works in you to will and to work according to his purpose, right? That's not monergism. That's not God doing everything. That's literally a working together. So,
and St. Basil the Great speaks about essence and energies at great length, right?
Yes.
I think it's letter 35. I don't remember. But anyway, that's very important. But this is, to denigrate Orthodox prayer as navel-gazing prayer technology. You are, I don't know. Anyway,
well,
I'm going to stop.
Let me just say, I can't think of a more Hindu way to pray than Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Like, what?
Right. Yeah. When you add all this up, I mean, he's basically saying that Orthodoxy is pagan. He's calling icons idols. He, or at least he's saying that we use arguments from idols. He's saying that we are navel gazers. It's tragic. All right. The last topic here. And again, I know it's not the last topic. It's all the time we have. Yeah. Let's play video number 5, please.
That Christ defeated death. But guess what happens if Christ defeats death alone? Sin is not atoned for. So Christus Victor never actually ends up becoming a theory of the atonement. It's just an aspect of Christ's victory where he defeats death, but without an atonement. And this is what happens, is Christ just gives people a chance to be saved if they follow this path of theosis. And so that was one of the things where I'm kind of looking through and reading the Church Fathers. I've absorbed this very popular presentation. That no, there's not this wrath of God that has to be dealt with. Christ didn't have to turn away the wrath of God. He didn't have to suffer for sin on the cross. All he had to do was really defeat death. And that was really what the curse was. It was only death. The sin part, God could just kind of turn a blind eye to. But then I'm reading Church Fathers and kind of medieval Byzantine writers like Simeon, the new theologian who predated Anselm, by the way. He's writing such clear things that sound like this horrid thing called penal substitutionary atonement. You mean Christ actually suffered?
Yeah. So I think this is a straw man. I really do. I think it's also a category error when he tries to create and say like an atonement has to be one thing, like one act. And you will see this, and I'm a little guilty of this, of saying, here's the different models of atonement, because this is really like a scholarly approach, right? I do think that I heard, and I'm going to tread very lightly here. I'm going to tread very lightly and say that I heard a very respected priest, an Orthodox priest who is a convert. It's much older now, and I respect him and I love him. I'm not going to name him, but he made the claim that the Orthodox Church, quote unquote, the Eastern Orthodox Church, needed the Western Rite because the Eastern Orthodox liturgy, that is the liturgy of John Chrysostom, is bereft of any mention of the atoning work of Christ. And this is a problem. I think it's a myopia, because while we can say, look, yes, the divine liturgy is this participation in the eternal offering of Christ to the Father, right? Which you have eruditely said often, that this is always ongoing at the throne of God. This is why he is enthroned at the right hand of the Father. It's a very good, read Hubers. This is very clear. But my point is, don't just look at the divine liturgy. Divine liturgy might be the apex of it, but you have to look at all the silent prayers. You have to look at the proscomedia, which I know is late. You have to look at all of the octoikos. You have to look at all of the Triodian. You have to look at all of the Pentecostarian. You have to look at all of it. You can't just take one thing and say, oh, the Orthodox only believe in the Christus Victor model. That's a straw man. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think, a couple things there. One, saying Christus Victor does not bring atonement. Well, if you don't have Christ conquering death, you don't get to the resurrection, which means you don't get to his atoning work in the heavenly tabernacle in Hebrews. So, if we want to talk about atonement theories, technically Christus Victor is closer to an atonement theory than penal substitution, because it actually involves priestly action after his victory. So I'll have a bone to pick a little bit there with that idea. But also just recognizing, when we say that, when I push back on something like penal substitutionary atonement, and I say that I don't think that the fathers were teaching it, especially in the way that he understands it, especially with that full slide of things that everybody brings to the table, point. Right? It's not to say that the wrath of God isn't dealt with. It's not to say that the cross has nothing to do with that. It's not to say that Jesus doesn't deal with sin. It's not to say atoning didn't happen in this overall process of what Christ did, but it's very different. It's very different from the way that we often popularly see people talking about penal substitutionary atonement. And so don't just think that because we're saying, oh no, that's not how the wrath of God was dealt with, that we're saying no wrath had to be involved at all, right? That's an oversimplification of our position too. And sometimes people might talk about things in a way where it can start to go in that direction from an Orthodox side. But, right. We are saved from the wrath to come. How are we saved from the wrath to come? Right. It's through Jesus. We know this, this is scriptural. Right. But does it have to be in the one way that apparently is the gospel for a lot of Protestants? That is penal substitution in the way they think about it. No, we do understand this differently. I think that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, I mean, you're using Lutheranism or Protestantism, because I know he's kind of moved around. You're using Lutheranism to disprove the fathers, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to say, well, Orthodoxy is wrong because they don't believe in my understanding of penal substitutionary atonement or my understanding of atonement, right? And I mean, we can look at hilasterion. We can look at the at the meaning of the word hilasterion, and we could start there and say, okay. And again, sorry to JP this to death, but like, what do you mean by atonement? What do you mean by hilasterion? Because there's a lot of different meanings to that word, and it's not what you think it is. Jesus is, I should say, the Father should not be turned into a pagan god who every time somebody does something wrong, he has to be satiated. He has to be placated. This is just as wrong, right? So let's define our terms and let's understand, and let's not make false claims about what Orthodoxy believes and what Orthodoxy doesn't believe. Let's learn our faith. Let's read the scriptures. Let's receive the sacraments. Let's venerate the icons. Let's understand that the living God came down from heaven, the second person of the Trinity, begotten before all ages, to unite himself to human nature and then live this life freely offering it to God, and is now seated at the right hand of God as the eternal offering of God's love for man and man's love for God, right? We are there with him. St. Paul says we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. And the theology in the incarnation is not simply there to prove some denominational point. The incarnation of God is to save us, is to redeem his creation, is to renew all of creation.
Yes.
And what I would say, bottom line, I want you to have the last word here on this part, is he had the opportunity. He had the opportunity to have the grandest view of God at the very holy table of the divine liturgy, and he gave it away for a very myopic, limited view of certain scriptures, and he just gave it away. Go ahead, Josh.
It's hard to follow that, knowing what you go through as a priest when you serve, and the significance that you understand there. I think the one thing I would point to, if I were going to try to help people put this maybe in a better framework, understand the image of God. If you understand that, then you understand Christ, the image of God. You understand iconography better. You understand all of sinned and fallen short of the glory of God better. Glory being imaging language, connecting to Psalm 8. You start to understand that this is about something bigger than just God being an accountant or a judge. And it's not that there aren't, aspects of justice going on here or anything else, but like the biggest frame for understanding all of this really is God as creator and as father, right? And to read Irenaeus, you end up having, who we see God as father because he created us, right? And God, talking about, God creating us in his image, we live and move and have our being in him. Like he connects all of that, even when he's talking to pagans on Mars Hill. What does it look like to understand that? And then also to understand that we can also talk about Father in terms of who we imitate, right? And that's where you start getting John the Baptist talking about to the religious leaders that came out to oppose him, saying, you're children of the devil. You're following in his ways. Don't do that, right? So understand the image of God, live into the image of God, and let the scriptures, let the services and the prayers of the church help you to do that.
Exactly. They will make the scriptures come alive. And the point is, Orthodox people need to read the scriptures. Stop ignoring it. Stop thinking that if you hear the Bible once a week, it's enough. You have to read this every day. There's a really good podcast called The Path. Go listen to it every day. All right. Now, I want to thank Joshua Sherman for joining us today. Joshua, tell us where people can find you online.
Mostly, I have been involved with some podcasts called Faith Unaltered and One Deep Calls Deep and Genesis Marks the Spot. I also have a podcast I started about the gospel that I did before I became Orthodox. It's called Tending Our Nets. And that one, there are a few things in there I would definitely change. So it's like, okay, let me go back. I might have to rework some of that a little bit. But if people want just a really quick, 5 to 7 minute episodes on the gospel, exploring some things, trying to understand it a little bit better, just don't get caught up where there are some things where you'll realize like, oh, he wasn't Orthodox yet. He didn't quite get this part, right? Some of the stuff we talked about today with atonement and all of that, you'll start to see where my views have shifted a bit. But recognizing, like the gospel is massive, and it's really just the announcement of Jesus Christ and who he is and the victory that he has accomplished and the reign that he has now and that he's coming to bring in full. So, that's what I would say.
God bless you for your faithfulness. We really appreciate you very much. People, a lot of our listeners say, oh, I'm so glad that Joshua's back. So we hope to have you on again and wish you much success in all of your endeavors. We really appreciate you very, very much. Hey, everybody in the chat, God bless you. You guys are killing it, man. I don't know what's going on there. There was just all kinds of things going on there. So I'll look forward to reading that later. If Simon, you would bring up the last slide. This is going to sound maybe just a little bit too much. God forgive me if I have to read this to myself first. Okay. These are the words of St. John Chrysostom, and he wrote a book called On the Priesthood. And he's commenting on Romans 9:3. And in Romans 9:3, St. Paul makes this really just crazy statement that shows how much he loves his fellow Jews. He says, "For I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen according to the flesh." Right? He's saying, if they would join themselves to Christ, he would just lose his salvation if he could just bring them to Christ. That is the mark of a true pastor. Now, that is the most serious thing that you can say. And what John Chrysostom is saying here, St. John Chrysostom, our father among the saints, is basically talking about how sacred the priesthood is and how seriously we have to take this. He says, if anyone can utter such a speech, if anyone has the soul which attains to such a prayer, he might justly be blamed if he abandoned the office. In other words, if he felt so strongly about it, he could kind of like say, well, yeah, he wasn't a priest anymore. He abandoned being a priest. But if anyone should lack such excellence, and then he says, much as I do, he's talking about himself, he would deserve to be hated. Not if he avoided the office, but if he accepted it. In other words, somebody that doesn't take it seriously, if he accepts being a priest, he should be shunned. I won't use the word that John used here. If indeed it be sufficient to bear the name of pastor, shepherd, and to take the work in hand haphazardly, and there be no danger in this, then let whoever pleases accuse me of vainglory. We cannot reduce the priesthood to selling books, to selling a doctrine, to whatever pleases me, that I become the definer of truth. When somebody takes on the priesthood, they have to do it willing to die for their flock. And as St. Paul says, even willing to give up their salvation for the truth. Because anything less means you're acting out of vanity. That's how serious this is. Mr. Schooping, don't do what you're doing. Don't sell Orthodox books and then in your videos turn people away from the truth. You can come back to the truth. You can come back to the Orthodox faith, but for God's sake, don't profit off of it. Don't profit off of the faith that you abandoned. God is always waiting for your return. God is waiting for you. He loves you. He will never turn anyone away who will repent with a pure heart. Purify your heart. Purify your mind. I will pray for you. Pray for me so that the truth will be acknowledged. That's our show for tonight. Remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday. Share out our program after that's posted. Hey, would you please like this program? Just like it right now. It helps us get the word out. We're doing a lot of good stuff here. You guys are killing it in the live chat. I love you all. Josh, thank you. Simon, Mike, thank you to everybody. We'll see you next week for another edition of Ancient Faith Today Live. Good night, everybody.